Welcome, everyone. The Costume Society of America thanks you for joining our Conversations on Dress webinar in the As Seen at Symposium series. My name is Kristen Miller-Zone, and I'm the Executive Director of CSA. Let's welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Caren S. Oberg, who studied at the University of Minnesota and received a PhD in dress, history, and culture. Her research foci include the relationships between materiality, meaning, and memory. Dr. Oberg became the curator of collections and exhibitions for the Valdez Museum and Historical Archive in Valdez, Alaska in September 2022. Her first exhibition, 300 Inches of Fashion, Clothing and the Stories of Valdez, acknowledges the importance of clothing in community memory, and the title is a nod to Valdez's average snowfall. Dr. Oberg will introduce today's presenters.
Thank you, Kristen. And hello, everyone from Alaska. In today's webinar, Anastasia Goodwin, Joshua D. Simon, and Ginger Stanciel discuss how they recontextualized colonial objects to produce new angles of learning to undergraduate and graduate students. Anastasia Goodwin is a costume designer and educator currently based at St. Mary's University in Minnesota, University of Minnesota in Winona, Minnesota. With many production credits under her belt, she's thrilled to usher in the next generation of entertainment and media artists. Her professional work includes theatrical and film titles at companies in the Pacific Northwest, Upper Midwest, New York, and Santa Fe. An immigrant from Russia, Anastasia holds a BFA in technical theater from the University of Central Missouri and an MFA in theatrical design costume from the University of Washington in Seattle. Joshua D. Simon graduated with a bachelor's degree from Central Michigan University in 2019 and a master's degree from Iowa State University in 2022. He is currently working on his PhD at Western Michigan University, and he is a dress historian and has researched the Gibson Girl, women's military uniforms, the style of former First Lady Betty Ford, and queer fashion history. Ginger Stanciel is the Programming, Engagement, and Exhibition Development Coordinator for Civics Projects Architecture in Chicago. Some of her exhibition and programming projects include the Obama Presidential Center Museum and the Museum of Science and Industry, Chicago. She completed her master's degree at Iowa State University, studying apparel merchandising and design, emphasizing museum studies and fashion history. Ginger received her Bachelor of Arts in Fashion Design from Kent State University. So we have a set of questions to guide our panel today. And the first question goes to Anastasia. How did you go about reframing dress history for your undergraduate class?
Thank you, Caren, and thank you everyone for being here. My process, I think, really started with recognizing a lot of the shortcomings in my teaching when I first started as a undergraduate instructor. Of course, like many of us who come in from an MFA background and from some time just working in the professional world, my kind of fallback was to go to the teaching that I grew up with, so to speak, grew up in the industry with. Okay, what do I remember about how I was taught and what can I adapt, and kind of what did I like, what I didn't like, and really just jumping off of the teaching that I was educated in. And after a few semesters of doing it, really starting to see that, of course, with my generation of educators and costume artists, we were all kind of in that sort of slideshow, PowerPoint, lecture and memorize mode of learning about costume history, and just looking at image after image, memorizing terminology, doing a test, and then moving on to the next period. And it was definitely all centered over on this overview survey of Western dress, and by Western, of course, we mean a kind of a slim demographic of the people who inhabited that that continent and those cultures, and just recognizing that wasn't obviously in the content area. There were a lot of shortcomings, just a lot of omissions, and a lot of nuance that fell by the wayside in this. But also just the teaching method itself, the lecture and lecture and test method. I really didn't feel like it reflected the fun, the richness, the joy of the experience that I felt with costume history. And so trying to figure out how to improve both. And in my mind, it really did become about that, it can't just be one or the other. That in trying to bring different new content had to come with different teaching methods too, because otherwise, it would still, if it's still like a lecture and memorize model, then how would that really make a point to the students as to why they need to know this content and why it's fun? So during the, I was fortunate that this kind of personal search happened for me during the time that we all moved to the virtual world, and there was space made in the virtual world for a lot of connections and finding people with whom otherwise it would have been probably harder to connect, coming from a smaller institution and not necessarily having funds to travel or to do that kind of in-person research. But during the summer of 2020, attending some of the workshops that were presented by USATT, United States Institute for Technical Theater, the costume commission there, and then discovering a group of educators and costume professionals who have created the Redressing the Narrative workshops, and connecting with the people who are working there, and finding that there's a whole bunch of people really trying to solve the problem of moving undergraduate education in costume history towards decolonizing the content and the curriculum as well. And so working with, I had a lot of help, I think is what I'm trying to say, but also trying to bring and to figure out some learning theory, teaching and learning theory, but also always viewing it from that lens of equity and access and justice was how it came about for me. I can put into the chat some of the websites that now hold a lot of these resources, and that way that people who are interested can follow those and explore those things as well.
And I forgot to ask you, what was the name of the class that you were teaching, and where did it fall within your university?
Oh, absolutely. So the class that I'm teaching, the title of the course is Dress and Fashion, Global History and Impact. And it is housed in the theater program. It is a junior level class in the theater program, but it is open to a general undergraduate audience, and it is meant to be taught within the general education program in our institution.
So the next question is to Joshua and to Ginger. How did your graduate class reframe dress history for your exhibition?
Yeah, excuse me. So the title of the exhibition is Fashion Forward, Centering Justice in Fashion History. So we sort of went about it. We knew that we wanted to do an exhibition, and we were kind of in the formulation process during it would have been like early part of the 2021 winter. So that meant it was still a lot of COVID precautions were happening. And so we weren't actually able to do a physical in-person exhibition initially. And so the actual first part that was developed for this exhibition was the digital component. And what we really wanted to do, we had just adopted a new mission at the Textiles and Clothing Museum that was all about literally, kind of as the title of the exhibit implies, centering justice and equity within our practices. And so that not only includes, hiring practices, collecting practices, it also includes what we exhibit. But at that time, all we had access to was objects that were already in the collection. So one of the ways that we came up with to go about kind of creating an exhibit that that kind of fit within our mission was to essentially kind of try to take these objects that have very common narratives that get taught, and just kind of reframed the narrative. So we tried to figure out like different angles that we could tell stories from, that weren't necessarily from dominant backgrounds. And then once we had kind of formulated everything and we had the digital exhibit all together, we physically mounted the exhibit as well. And so we were able to provide that experience. We, in the gallery, we were able to put a curator talk in there that was kind of explaining kind of our process and what we were doing, to kind of give an interactive element as well. And yeah, Ginger, I don't know if you have anything to add, perhaps?
Yeah, and I think a big part of getting to do both a virtual and an in-person exhibition was really kind of democratizing access to this. So social justice was implemented in every aspect of the development of and implementation of this exhibit. So we definitely prioritize accessibility. So with everything from making sure that our our artifact labels were in a size font that was appropriate for every legibility, readability, as well as making sure like the colors of the title banner were acceptable for people with vision problems and impairments.
So going now back to Anastasia's institution, which if you can say your institution again in just a moment, can you tell us a little bit about what changes might have already been happening at your institution, to allow, which provided a frame for this class? And then Anastasia, once you talk about the class, it's the same question over to Ginger and to Joshua, which is, what is the framework that was maybe already happening at your university? And the reason I ask this is I think a lot of us might come to this and say, oh, you're doing these great things, but you're not doing them in a vacuum. And in fact, there's kind of a structure underneath that almost might have to happen before you can do these things. Or I could be wrong. It actually could be, look, we just were entrepreneurial and took the leap, and look what happened. So Anastasia, if you could go first and tell us a little bit about yours.
Absolutely, thank you. So my institution is St. Mary's University of Minnesota. It is a small undergraduate program, and it's within I think about 2 hours. We're about 2 hours away from the Twin Cities in Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul. So we're in a fairly rural setting. We do have an excellent art museum here in Winona that has paintings like are pretty unbelievable that they're here, including some great like lesser known works of like very well known European artists in their permanent collection. But they're also great about bringing in traveling collections that also include a lot of textile work. So, so we have a few resources here locally, but a lot of it does have to come from either some sort of digital, a virtual visit, or kind of having to be a little bit more creative. As such, though, I think the institution, the biggest help was the current framing of their general education program, which was aimed to help students, I guess, frame their liberal arts kind of general education program around, they settled on 4 different, what they called interdisciplinary minors. And 2 of those really work well within the kind of questions that costume history deals with. It's in environmental sustainability, as well as global diversity and social justice. So having those thematic frameworks for general education really allowed me to show that this subject, this topic, and this discipline is very much related to the kind of issues that they want students to explore, and the lenses that they can look at the human experience through, and the way they can study liberal arts are really very well represented in dress history, but definitely if it is taught with a very global perspective as opposed to, I guess, the more traditional way in which it was taught before. So I think having that kind of understanding of the liberal arts in the next century, in this kind of global information age that our students are going to be living and working in, was very helpful in order to get the university to understand why they might want a class like that. And there's certainly been more demand from the students, I would say, especially when it comes to things like environmental sustainability and just how do our actions and how do our everyday actions affect the world around us more immediately, but also globally. So a lot of students are interested in concepts such as fast fashion. And of course, in order to learn what that is and where it comes from and why it is what it is, you have to understand the more global fashion history as it developed. So both, I think, institutional and student support is what helped in creating this class and getting it done.
From our end, talking about the exhibit and kind of, what changes were already happening and how we were working within that. I would say the department was very supportive of kind of our endeavors. So the Textiles and Clothing Museum is within the apparel, merchandising and design program within the department that includes apparel as well as hospitality management and events. And the overarching department and the department chair were very supportive of such efforts. And so that is kind of how we were able to, or that was the context that we were working in. We also, kind of like I had said earlier, we had just, a few months before, adopted a new mission. So that was kind of something that we were working from as well, and had that language to kind of support and guide us, which was really, really helpful. I imagine that at other institutions where such topics don't necessarily have the same level of support, it might be a bit more difficult, because I will say that was one of the really helpful things, was we knew that kind of our vision was being supported, and so we were able to make that come into fruition.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on that as well, when we first started our graduate program at Iowa State, our fashion history course within the apparel merchandising and design department, which was a required class for graduation for design and merchandising students, that course for I believe 4 semesters prior to when we started, they kind of had started reworking that class to be more socially justice, to have more of a social justice lens in how they taught dress history, as well as kind of uplifting overlooked designers, as well as really kind of recreating that kind of hands-on connection with the museum as well. So for us to be able to TA those courses and work on this exhibit, we really got lots of insight into kind of maybe the gaps in knowledge that some of our students had, and really used the exhibit as a way to also kind of fill those gaps and expand their knowledge on the topic in a way that we may not have had time to cover in class.
And Ginger or Joshua, if you could take a moment, there was a third graduate student who couldn't be a part of this. But if you can mention her really quickly, just give her some time as well, since she was a part of this.
Oh yeah, of course. So it was 3 of us. So Kyra Streck, who's doing amazing things out in Portland right now and couldn't be here today, unfortunately. It was 3 of us and Dr. Reddy Best and Dr. Jennifer Gordon. It was our team doing the exhibits and working with class as well. So we had a really solid team, and we wouldn't have been able to do all the amazing work that we did without them.
Excellent. And yeah, that was something when I was talking to the three of you earlier as we were preparing for this panel, is this idea of the structures that need to be a part of the institutions that you're a part of, that our audience is a part of, that those of us in museums are a part of, that are supporting this work, this important work of decolonization. Yes, decolonization, and taking things that are either that we're already teaching or already in our collections that we can't change but can reinterpret, and the legitimacy of doing so. So now that we've sort of looked at the positive part of having the institution supporting what you're doing, what conflicts, if any, arose from either your students, Anastasia, your undergraduate students perhaps, or other people in your department, for Joshua and Ginger, perhaps other students out of your visitorship maybe, or outside of your grad program, any conflicts that arose?
Yeah, so thankfully, kind of as Joshua was talking about, we didn't really run into too many issues with students. I think the only thing that was really kind of not an issue, but something that it was a learning experience for us in terms of, okay, if we were to do this again, how would we change things? A lot of students, we had both contemporary and historical objects on display. And so many students really enjoyed the more contemporary objects and how they connected directly with their lives. And you can kind of see here the gallery space. So you can see from here, like both historical and contemporary objects. But I feel like the only issues that arose was kind of when we were trying to tell these social justice stories and social justice activism with historical objects. I think that that was a little harder for people to maybe understand or relate to. We had a sweater from the 1920s Paris Olympics, and we talked about kind of the racial lack of racial diversity in the Olympics prior to a certain point and how that connected to contemporary times. And I think that that as a concept was a little harder for people to kind of make that connection. But like I said, it was a learning experience, and kind of maybe next time, maybe we try to be a little bit more clear in terms of descriptions or maybe how we display an object. But again, circling back to what Josh was saying, we were taking objects that are staples in established small or university collections, like the white lingerie dress from the early 20th century, and trying to really showcase how these concepts can be applied to contemporary life. And I think that we realized that that is a lot harder than it looks, but I think that we did a really great job on that, and that maybe not all the students really kind of got the connections that we were trying to make, but I think that that kind of speaks to the progress of this and of having classes like Anastasia's and having programs and museums that are trying to do this work.
And I don't have, Ginger explained it beautifully. I don't have anything to add, but just to answer a question from the chat quickly, I can share as well. We have a virtual walkthrough. So if anyone's interested in looking at that, it does go through. You can either do the digital exhibit, or I'll share. There's also there's like a YouTube video walkthrough, so it's as if you're the perspective of the visitor, and so I'll share some of those as well if anyone would like to look at it.
And for me to answer the question, again, I think I was fairly fortunate in teaching this class. This has only been taught once so far, and I think all the students that took it in that first semester were really interested in not only the subject but the framework too. So overall, it was a very positive experience in that way. But again, looking at maybe some of the bigger lessons, and this was one of those things that I think they really got to appreciate through this experience, is they really got a chance to see that once when they were given assignments to do some research that would push them outside of the canon of Western dress and trying to get specific, some of them really got to some very significant roadblocks of just the information not being there or information not being digitized. And it was a real learning experience for them to know that even in our age, when they're so used to thinking that everything's out there on the internet, right, and you can find the answers, you just like have to type in the right search engine. But some of these very specific things that they were looking for, they're not, nobody's had time or been able to take photographs or to scan things or to digitize them. And once you kind of go a step away from the stuff that everybody knows, doing the research on dress is really becoming very challenging without doing it, the old school way, I guess, or in a way that would take you away from your computer screen and your dorm room. So I think for me as an instructor in the future, I'll take that into account with the kind of assignments I have them do and the way I guide them through them. But I think it was a big wow moment for all of us. Just the scope, I guess, of part of the issue that we're all dealing with is that so much of this isn't out there. So it's easy to think that um, there's only a small set of things to work with, relatively speaking.
In hearing about digitization, that's just another push to our funders to keep funding digitization, because it's important for students and researchers to be able to get to the things in our collections in that way. And then what was the most successful part about your class or your exhibition? Joshua and Ginger for the exhibition and Anastasia for the class.
It was, gosh, I would say probably the most, or I guess the element that was most successful, I would say was kind of probably the reception that we had from it, because I think it was pretty well received. We were able to present it at a conference that was specifically focused on racial and ethnic diversity within the Iowa State community and broader community as well, sharing scholarship related to that. And we had a lot of positive comments from people who were, in and doing social justice work, but were not necessarily in the fashion and textile or museum fields, either way. And so it was really nice to kind of hear from, everybody that, it was really interesting exhibit. And then I will say too, I guess this, maybe a second most successful thing, tied for most successful, I would say was the accessibility of it, because that was something that we really, really put a lot of time into. And that's not to say that there aren't improvements that could be made, of course, but I feel like it is really, really accessible for a lot of different types of people. We did like readable reader text. So if you use a screen reader, it will read everything aloud, and also with picture descriptions. So it will do that. And we also kind of tried to appeal to different learning styles. So on the digital exhibit, there's YouTube videos embedded in it. There's interactives where you can fill out polls, where you can move things back and forth. So just to kind of appeal to people that may not, be readers of things or anything. And we had met with accessibility services at the university. We're fortunate to have that, and they were really helpful in kind of not only the digital exhibit, but also some of the phrasing and things like that. Of how to navigate everything being as accessible as possible. So I would say that combined with the reception were two of the most successful elements of it.
I think kind of to piggyback about that as well, about accessibility. I think that for me, it was really exciting to see how we went from this virtual exhibit to having it in person, and having students not only be able to view it online and have all these interactive elements online, but also to bring in kind of a kiosk with interactive elements for students and faculty to come visit in the gallery. And I think one thing that I thought was really successful was the fact that we'd kind of come through the galleries in a regular building on campus with classrooms in it, and we would have the gallery open as much as possible, if not all the time. And I think what was cool was getting to see that there were students just sitting in there on the bench looking at stuff any time of the day. And I think that that was the thing that really, for me, was like, this is a success. People would not be in here interacting with the exhibit if it was not a success. And we had students that were asking us about it when we come to class, like, oh, I went to the exhibit, I had some questions, and or wanting to know more. And I think that having students get to not only see objects but have that contextualization outside of just the textbook was, for me, I felt like that was when it was like, yes, like, yes.
For me, I think some of the most successful aspects, I guess I have two that I will talk about. The first one about kind of centers on the learning objectives, what I was hoping to achieve, and what I think did work. And one of my biggest goals for the class was to show the students, first of all, the interconnected nature of dress and fashion, because so many of them come in first of all, with a kind of understanding that fashion is simply something that like happens in Vogue magazine and on the runways and on Kylie Jenner's Instagram, and that what they wear on their body every day kind of is a totally different world that has nothing to do with that, and to really get them to understand how connected everything is, but also not just within their own lives, but also in terms of how fashion develops, how it travels, truly how many people there are at every step of the process from idea to creation, and how that's definitely seems like it's something that's a contemporary phenomenon, but that it actually isn't, and that it's been developing for a very long time. And these series of global networks that all converge on dress history in a way that I don't know that they've been ever shown before. And just to watch them realize that and understand that, and then thinking through how that affects other decisions in their lives that don't necessarily have anything to do with clothing, or how they view history in general, how they view art in general. It was really it really worked, I thought, in the way that the class was structured. And in terms of class climate, I guess my goal was to make sure that the theater students and the non-theater students have a chance to interact and work together, since the class still had that disciplinary designation. And the majority of the students in the class this time around were theater students. I only had a few that weren't. And that the it wasn't an issue, it wasn't a barrier. And in fact, the non-theater students brought so much to the class just because of a different way that they've been trained to do research and to look at problems. And so I think everybody learned from each other in very meaningful ways too. And so that was something that I thought went really well this time around.
I love what you just said about how people from outside of the fashion theater world can bring so much to the table. I think that for our exhibit, when we had our opening and our curatorial talks, having students that were not remotely from our department come to these events and come to the exhibit and learn and think that this was interesting and cool and ask us about, hey, like, are there classes in your department for people not in this major? And having that level of accessibility, having that democratization of
Mhm.
knowledge, I think that has got to be like one of the bigger successes as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. That again, that interconnectedness of everything, and how literally the fabric and the thread, right? It's right there in our language, and how it all connects us.
And so, what longer term changes have you seen or are you hoping to see at your institutions because of this class or because of the exhibition? And hopefully, it's a lot more of what Ginger just said as well.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I hope that there are more opportunities at a broader number of institutions to talk about things like this and to explore these types of histories. Because I think that while the mainstream canon is important to have that base knowledge, I think it's important to learn about outside perspectives and just think about how there's multiple angles for everything. So I guess I would say I hope that there are more institutions that do kind of support those types of exhibits or those types of classes. And I do think that there are. It's of course a process, but I do think there are. I was really fortunate. I was hired on as as the assistant curator of exhibits at a local history museum, just as a part-time thing while I'm a student. And one of the reasons that they were really interested and ended up hiring me was because they're interested, in doing like something like this, in their own museum. So they, tell local history and it goes throughout time, but a lot of it is very skewed to one certain perspective. And so just kind of not specifically dress history, but just generic local history, even how do we reframe and retell this? So that way, for example, right now, it begins with talking about indigenous peoples, and there is currently in there is a model of a wigwam, but actually we're forming a sort of indigenous advisory board to kind of figure out how to go about discussing pre-contact and post-contact indigenous peoples. And one of the interesting things that we were finding out was that like this this wigwam that's already in the museum is not even local to the area that we're talking about. More appropriate would be a longhouse. So just things like that, where it's like big changes that even even might not even be right. So I hope that there are more institutions that kind of take that leap, and I really do think that there are.
Yeah, to kind of follow up with that as well, I think that we were exceptionally lucky to get to do what we did at Iowa State. And not to say that we were the first to do that. We have Dice Matthews is here, and she did some amazing work while she was at Iowa State as well before us, and had an incredible exhibit that talked about Black activism and dress on university campuses. And then this kind of our exhibit, at least too, really inspired us, the three of me, Josh, and Kira, to kind of create our own exhibits the following year that really focused on that kind of democratization of knowledge and really uplifting underrepresented groups in the dress history narrative. Josh did an amazing exhibit on Luis Estevez that really, really showcased kind of going more in depth about certain topics that we did cover in this exhibit. So I think that if we can keep doing it and keep going forward, I think that you're going to start seeing in the next few years some really cool exhibits, not just at smaller university museums, but at larger museums as well. That is my big hope, that we start seeing that a little bit more.
I think for me, in terms of costume history education, and especially both in undergrad programs and also just in theater programs in general, part of it, of course, is just to give the educators the time and space to make these changes. A lot of times, costume educators have to do anywhere from 3 to 4 jobs between being the designer, the shop manager, then the instructor of the course, and also serving on, in some cases, serving on committees and doing all this kind of work. And of course, things like reworking or adapting curriculum for one or a number of courses, it takes time and it takes effort. And so my hope is that more institutions, more departments, when recognizing the value to their students in this kind of education, in this reframing of these narratives and the way these classes are taught, that they will give their faculty, their instructors, the support to make the change, to do the necessary research, and just all the things that go into class design. Um, and another part of that too, more generally, is the idea of, I was thinking a lot about the fact that, when I was first teaching costume history and kind of thinking about, oh, what classes did I have? How did I learn this stuff? But then realizing lately that actually a good chunk of my education didn't come from the 2 or 3 courses that I took, but it came a lot from the shows that I've worked on. So getting the kind of production work into our departments, and then into the theater at large, that will uplift the voices that we haven't heard from so much, and that would give the designers the kind of artistic drive to work in a different way, is another part of that too. So both from the pedagogical side, but also from the production side. Hopefully longer term, we will see more and more of this kind of effort.
So the last question for our panelists is, we talked about longer term changes within your institutions, but what long term changes do you hope to see in the field, in the dress history education field at large?
So, as I've said a few times on this panel, I love to see like accessibility, increased accessibility to dress history knowledge and education, period. But within that, what can we do to broaden our understanding of dress history? So many of the textbooks, from even when I was first into dress history in middle school, so many of the textbooks and books that are out there really are fantastic books, but they really focus on a certain socioeconomic class, a certain race, a certain region of the world. So I would like to see, and I think we really saw this when we did our exhibit and saw students and people interacting, they really loved learning about other cultures and the reasons behind certain things. So I feel like a really great example of this was we had a cashmere shawl on display in this exhibit. And within that, we talked about cultural appropriation and how that design and paisley design came from a certain part of the world and ended up being this like statement in Northern Europe and in England. And a lot of people do not know that history, and they found it really interesting to really connect that idea of cultural appropriation in the 21st century, that definition, to a definition in the 19th century that had real socioeconomic impact on people's livelihoods. And I think that just seeing how hungry people are and interested people are in this knowledge, I think that seeing more people publish articles, do exhibits, do books about this. And we're really, like I said, starting to kind of start seeing that more and more. But like, I'm hungry for it. I want to see more. I want people to do more. And for students especially, I think what Anastasia is doing with her class is absolutely fantastic, because it starts in the classroom. People getting interested in these topics and then going on to write articles, design exhibits, put this into action in real life, and also taking dress education kind of outside of strictly the academic sphere, having people that may have, like we talked about earlier, have nothing to do with fashion or theater or anything remotely with that, be interested and have access to this information.
I would say, so when I think about dress history education, one of the, I would say probably, biggest strategies used is object-based learning, and really getting people in to see or bring the objects to people. Every dress history course I've interacted with, which has been a few universities now, has always done this in some sort of capacity. And I come from a fairly strong collections background, so part of me is hoping that kind of I guess the institutions that are providing these objects for dress history students to learn from, adjust and kind of think about collecting practices. And they say that because kind of how Ginger mentioned, so I was doing work on a designer named Luis Estevez, and one of the, I think, most jarring moments when I was doing that research was looking at the Met specifically, which obviously that's not necessarily a learning collection, but I figured it was a good place to start. And the just discrepancy in amount of objects and types of objects between Estevez, who was a person of color and who was also openly queer. He had 4 objects in the collection where all of his contemporaries had over 120. And so it's that real like discrepancy in proportion as well. Objects by Estevez, and not just specifically Estevez, but a lot of different designers of color, queer designers, women designers, may not be in those collections for those students to see and pick up and grab and understand through that object-based learning. So I hope that kind of institutions begin to pivot collecting practices and think through those things, so that way within the educational sphere, when it comes to that object-based learning, they're seeing kind of a more more true picture of all the people that were working in the industry or were putting out designs or, whatever they were doing. I would say that's kind of one of the things that I really hope to see, really, obviously long term. That's not something that happens overnight, but definitely a long term hope would be really great.
For me, and this is obviously in addition to the wonderful ideas that Ginger and Joshua had already stated, but I keep coming back to the idea of the role of making and creating in education, and this is where I think maybe my costume background really shows. But I really have seen a big change in one of the projects in my class was about. We explored the shibori dyeing process from Japan, and then students kind of tried their hand at it a little bit, and a couple of them knew how to hold a needle and thread in their hands before, and most of them did not. Um, and just the change in how they viewed every object after that, just after having that experience of not just thinking about objects of dress in this kind of immediate way, um, and even after like looking at the museum pieces or touching them, but it's different when you, I think, try actually making something. And there is some research now being done on learning through making and that kind of experiential learning, and it's all very exciting. um, but because it seems, with each generation our students have less and less opportunity for things like home ec or any kind of class in their early education where they get to try and create something. um, I think it's very important at some stage when talking about dress history to bring the actual, not just the physical object that's finished, but the process of creating it into the conversation, but not in the same way that, say, costume constructions students learn how to sew. So the goal wouldn't necessarily be to like make the best straightest stitch you've ever done, but really to understand this is the process, and somebody had to repeat this process for many, many hours in order to create this beautiful thing that you see, because it really lands differently. I think after I tell students how to do a backstitch and then say, look at this painting of Marie Antoinette, and every single thing on her was created by using this stitch. It really, it's just not something I think you can understand in theory until you've tried it. So to summarize, I guess finding ways in bringing the creating, the physical making into the conversation and into the classroom, which is, can be challenging. That's definitely a big goal. But I do think it's an important one.
That is incredible, and you just kind of like unlocked a forgotten memory of mine. When I was an undergrad, I was at Kent State and I was taking a historical textiles course with Dr. Catherine Leslie over there. Absolutely love her. And one of our assignments was we had to write a paper on a type of embroidery, basically any type of like a type of historical finishing or textile strategy, and then you had to do it. And so I chose black work because I'm a big Renaissance fan. A lot of my research has revolved around the Renaissance. And so I chose black work. And it's one thing to research about it and read about it, but actually doing it, I struggled so hard doing it. But I learned so much of like, and looking at, as you put it, as you're looking at paintings and images of these things, and you're seeing how intricate it is and how many you can only fathom. It took me, I did a little piece like this big, like barely even that big. And it took me like 3 days. So doing that on such a broader scale, finishing somebody's chemise, cuff, their collar, their hem of their like, it has such a greater impact, and especially for students that are just so interested in it, it can like it changes the game. And I think that incorporating that in your classes, like I'm so excited to hear that you do that because personally, having been in a class where we did that, I learned and loved it so much.
Yeah, and after that, it's like, oh, that's why one lace collar cost half a year's wages, because making like a square inch is 3 days of work, et cetera, et cetera.
And actually, with that, I think one of the audience questions, we're just going to bounce into it because it goes right to what Ginger, it's a question for Ginger, and it goes actually kind of right into her background. So Ginger, I'm going to put you on the spot here. And one of the questions is, have you had opportunities to apply what you learned while curating this exhibition into your current work? We heard a little bit about that from Joshua, so I want to hear from you.
Yeah, so a lot of my work is both kind of exhibition development and also kind of community engagement and getting community engagement feedback and kind of communicating that to museums about how they can implement, change things, and improve with a social justice lens, of course. I think the one thing that comes to mind immediately is accessibility. A lot of the work that we did for accessibility translated to some of my projects, but on like a massive, massive scale. Like our gallery isn't exceptionally huge, but kind of applying those principles to every single case in like huge museums, I felt like I came in on the ground floor with enough knowledge that I could survive and thrive and keep learning. And I think too, I feel like everything that I learned working on this exhibit has helped with my current job just because one of the greater things about working in a smaller university museum is that we did everything. We did everything from lighting design to dressing the mannequins to designing and printing and mounting the labels on the cases. We did everything, and I think that definitely applies to a lot of the work that I do. Unfortunately, I can't give you specifics on some of the work that I do, but just broadly, that is, I feel like everything we did, having that very hands-on in every single aspect of the exhibit development really helps out.
So our institution will not necessarily give us adequate time and space to make these changes. So what would be one simple change to start? And while you're thinking of an answer, I'm actually going to bounce in with an answer, which is something that I had forgotten about, which was making sure color schemes work for people with color blindness. I think, Ginger, you and Joshua had talked about that either in a meeting or you talked about it here, where reds and greens, and color blindness being an accessibility issue. So to the panelists, what one simple change would you suggest?
So one thing that we've gotten from kind of talking about this exhibit over the last year and a half, a lot of feedback we got was that like I kind of said before, all the objects that were in this exhibit were already in our collection. We didn't acquire anything new, and a lot of these were staple pieces. 19th century evening wear, early 20th century lingerie dress, cashmere shawl, textile 19th century textiles. These are all pieces that are very commonly found in institutions, and all we did was we just recontextualized them, and that does not cost any money. That just takes time and research. And so what we did was we had all these objects on display, and we did the research. We tried to figure out kind of how can we recontextualize this object with a social justice lens. And kind of as Josh and I talked about before, it did take time just because we are working with objects that we started our research during COVID, and we were working all online. So when you're looking up information about 19th century green collage, like there may not necessarily be information online, but we did what we worked with. We used the New York Times archive as well. And we really kind of gathered our resources and kind of rallied together to find information. But I think the big thing of kind of a simple triangle, simple start would definitely be working with what you have and kind of just recontextualizing it with words.
And if now coming at it from a point of view of maybe a class or not being able to completely redesign the curriculum or retool the class, again, in terms of if it's a theater class that uses dramatic text as like a basis for a research process, then the simplest place to start probably would be just choosing a different play, a play that would have the kind of characters that would encourage research into cultures and times that aren't that you haven't done before, that would be underrepresented in the kind of traditional canon. Another way, again, if still the slide and lecture is the modality and that it has to stay that way for whatever reason, just slowly interspersing things in there that are parts of a different canon or parts of a different cultural point of view. And there are even in any sort of period or lineup, you can find ways and places to add or to maybe edit some things out so something new can take its place. And again, it can start with just a few at a time until there is such a place to do a kind of a more complete revamp. And in terms of assignments too, it can be the kind of research that students are asked to do, or the kind of objects that they need to work with. All of that can be somewhat flexible, and just a little bit of thinking and a little bit of creativity until such time as hopefully more support comes.
And then I just to add something, one really simple, easy thing that I did was when after we did this exhibit, I was kind of trying to think of, I was like, okay, thinking of global perspectives. And so one of the things I've started to try to make a point of doing is when I say, oh, I'm interested in fashion history, I like always say I'm interested in like I study Western fashion history, which I know is kind of implied, but it also does, like, I had a conversation with someone who was not into any sort of fashion history, and so when I said that, they were like, oh, so you are interested in the history of like cowboy boots and like hats and things? And I was like, no, actually, it's a specific kind of region and countries, and it's a little bit deeper, but it kind of started that conversation. So something as simple as that, where it's just adding that and acknowledging this is one type of fashion, but there's a entire world of fashion outside of Western perspectives. And just because it's Western doesn't mean it's, all of fashion history or overarching. That was something that was really simple, but I think spurred some productive conversations.
This has actually been a joy to work with the three of you and put this panel together, and reminding me, because I've been out of academia now for about a year, and reminding me, what are the great opportunities within academia, but also I'm now in a small museum, and what are all the great opportunities we have to rethink our collections here at small museums, that the word, I should really not say the word small, that museums have these opportunities that we have to start reconsidering and looking at our collections with new lenses. And so I really appreciate, in our day-to-day work, we can kind of forget. So being able to work with panelists and get to talk to people really reminded me of that. We have a thanks for the information and inspiration. I agree. Thank you to the three of you for that. I have a few special thank yous. A special thank you also to CSA's VP to Tech, Graham Wetzbarger, CSA VP External, Karen DePaul, and Kate On, and of course, Kristen Millerzone in the CSA office. And please follow the Costume Society of America on Facebook and Instagram to make sure you hear about all the upcoming episodes of Conversation on Dress, and consider donating on the CSA's website to the organization to support this and other programming. Thank you and have a good night.